Welcome to Food for Thought, giving you the tools and resources you need to live according to your values of compassion and wellness, joyfully, healthfully, deliciously, and sustainably. Today's episode is part one of a series on Italian cuisine. Today is Southern Italian cuisine, pizza, pasta, and produce. Before we begin, my name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You can find me at joyfulvegan.com. You can find me on social media. You can find my books wherever books are sold. And you can join me in my online cooking classes or in my vegan trips around the world. On my trips around the world. You can find the trips at joyfulvegantrips.com and everything else at joyfulvegan.com. I'm so excited for you to see the new website. I'm working very diligently on a new website, and oh my God, it's going to be so good. It's going to be so good. As you know, this podcast is 100% listener supported. So if it's something you enjoy, if it's something you value, if it's something you listen to and share, please join other supporters by going to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You could also go to joyfulvegan.com for that. Under donate, you'll find information about that if you want one click. And the new website, it will be even easier. But you can become a supporter if you go to patreon.com. You can choose whatever level appeals to you. I almost said appears to you. Whatever level appears to you, you can choose. Perks include discounts to my virtual cooking classes, bonus content, podcast transcripts, and more. And don't forget to share the love by leaving ratings and reviews of this podcast and sharing it with your network. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing fabulously well. I want to just thank everyone who stepped up in response to my call to action to support this podcast. Even $5 a month helps. Higher levels have perks, as I named, but everything really helps. And the bottom line is thank you. I do hope you consider becoming a supporter. Okay. I'm so excited to talk to you today about Italian cuisine. My favorite cuisine, I'm sure the favorite cuisine of many of you listening. And we're going to go deep. I could not possibly do one episode on Italian cuisine. We had to break it down. Frankly, I could do an entire series on the regions of Italy and the different cuisines in those regions. We're going to talk about the regions, but I'm going to take this in bigger chunks. And I'm super excited to share this with you. I am a quarter Italian. You don't have to be to love Italian food, obviously, but I'm a quarter Italian. However, I did not grow up in an Italian family. I grew up in a very Irish family. My father is 100% Irish. His parents are 100% Irish. His grandparents are 100% Irish. We go back, and my Irish ancestors came over during the potato famine in the 19th century. My mother, her mother was Scottish and Irish. And her father was Italian. Her biological father was Frank Carline, but actually that name was changed when his father came over from Italy. His father's name was Sebastiano Carlini. I love that name so much. So Frank Carline is my mother's biological father, and Frank Carline's father was Sebastiano Carlini. I'm just going to keep saying that. But my mother never knew either of them. Frank Carline and my grandmother, Anne Calhoun, so that's Scottish for you. It's actually an Irish name as well, but it's actually my grandmother's name is spelled on her birth certificate, the Scottish spelling for Calhoun, which is just a crazy. You look at this word and you think, how can you get Calhoun out of that? Because there's a Q in there. Anyway, you can look that up. So Frank Carline, Anne Calhoun, they had an affair, possibly a passionate one, hopefully a loving one, and that resulted in a pregnancy. But Frank did not stick around for that, so my grandmother was left with child in 1935, not exactly a good time to be an unwed mother. And a man named Wilbur was in love with my grandmother, so the story goes, and wanted to give my mother a name, so to speak. That's what we would say. And so Wilbur married my grandmother. Wilbur married Anne, knowing that this was not his biological daughter. But he stepped up and they went on to have 5 more children. Now, unfortunately, he was not very kind to my mother. He was more than just not kind. He was physically abusive to her, and he was verbally and physically abusive to all of the kids, but he was especially cruel to my mother. He knew that she wasn't his biological daughter. She did not know that. She did not know that her biological father was Frank Carline. So my mother left home by the time she was 16 or 17, and she lived with a man named Don Henriksen, who loved her very much, and his parents. That's who she went to go live with. They were very good to my mother, and it was when she was 18 that she discovered that Wilbur was not her biological father, that her father was indeed this Italian named Frank. She didn't know that until that stage in her life. Now, she went on to marry Don. I think that's when she actually discovered it. I think she needed her birth certificate or something. She needed something, and that's when she saw on her birth certificate a different name, completely different name than the name she had been raised with, and a completely different name than the father she'd been told was her father. And she went on to marry Don. She never had any children from Don. She was married to him for 10 years, and she divorced him 10 years later and married my father and had 2 children, my sister and then me. And it was 10 years after being married to my father. God bless my mother for being married to my father that long. Love my father, but not marriage material. And they divorced. That is a very long, sad story. But I remember around that time, I would have been about 10 or 11. It would have been 1980, 1981. And I remember my mother being about 45. She would have been about 45. And I remember her looking for her biological father. And she was incredibly resourceful, and she was incredibly determined, and she found him by way of his sister. Now, his sister would have been in her 70s or 80s by then, and she was incredibly kind to my mother, and she was very helpful to her, but my mother was too late to meet her biological father. He had died a few years before, and it turned out he had gotten married, and he had 2 children, who were alive when my mother found them. And so it turned out she had a half sister and a half brother. Now, interestingly, and I think quite touchingly, it turned out that my mother's half sister had the same name as my mother. And I don't think that was a coincidence. And I say it was touching because, as touching as it can be for a man who didn't stay with my grandmother, but who obviously was there for my mother's birth, because his name is on my mother's birth certificate. Frank Carline is on my mother's birth certificate. So he was around for her birth. And my mother's name is not a very common name. I don't even think it was a very common name at that time. Her name was Arlene. And when he went on to marry and have his own, I shouldn't say his own, another daughter, he and his wife named her Arlene. And so I don't think that was a coincidence because, as I said, he may have even helped name my mother, but he was definitely there. He knew she was named Arlene. He was on the birth certificate. So at least there's that. And so many years later, after my mother met her half siblings and started cultivating a relationship with them, I started looking into applying for Italian citizenship. So there's a perk of having an Italian ancestor, and it's Italy's program, desire, quest to increase the population. So they have this program where you can apply, and if you meet these criteria, having ancestors who did not denounce their Italian ancestry or citizenship when they came to the United States, you can apply for Italian citizenship. And it would mean having a dual citizenship between the United States and not just Italy, but of course the EU. And so I started looking into this, and it's a bit complicated. I found the documents. I've found many documents, and I started working with, someone who specializes in this to help me. But I did find the documents of Sebastiano Carlini coming over from Italy to Ellis Island, and that's where he changed his name to Carline, but his name was Sebastiano Carlini. And so I started looking into what it would require for me to be able to apply for citizenship. It's complicated because, well, it's very complicated. If you've ever done this, you know that there's a lot involved, and you need help doing this because you have to get all of the documents from Italy and from from you need marriage certificates and death certificates and birth certificates, and it's very complicated. And my mother, because she has documents that say Carline, she has documents that say Hendrickson, she has documents that say Patrick. She never changed her name. She wouldn't have known. She said she used to joke that she wouldn't, because I was like, why did you keep Patrick? Why did you keep that name? Because she had a pretty tumultuous divorce from my father, not an amicable divorce at all. And there was a time when she was just really angry with my father, and it pains me to think of how hurt she was. But she kept his name. And I was always like, why did you keep his name? And she said, I didn't know what name to go back to, because she had Maroney from Wilbur. Carline was on her birth certificate, though she never met him. Hendrickson was her first husband. Patrick was my father. And Calhoun, she'd never used her mother's name. But so she said she just kept Patrick for that reason. And so because she has so many different names, it's just messy. There was a time where I called the Italian consulate in San Francisco. This is many years ago when I first started looking into this. And it was actually really funny because the woman I spoke to said, your name is well, I don't know if she said your name. She said, your voice is very familiar. And I said, well, I have a podcast. She goes, oh, I listened to your podcast. So she was a podcast listener at the Italian consulate in San Francisco. Anyway, I may revisit that another time, but all that's to say is I'm a quarter Italian from my mother's paternal ancestry. But Italian was not part of my immediate culture growing up, not in my immediate family. But Italian was a huge part of my culture growing up because I grew up in New Jersey, just outside of New York. And of course, New York has the highest population of Italians outside of Italy. Also, a couple of my mother's sisters married Italians. So at home, at the homes of cousins and aunts and uncles, at restaurants, I grew up eating Italian, or really Italian-American cuisine. And I make this distinction because the cuisine I grew up eating, while most of it was actually developed by Italian immigrants, most of it is decidedly Italian-American. And one of the ways you can tell that something is Italian-American versus Italian from Italy is that it's very meat heavy, very different than the plant heavy cuisine of Italy, and especially southern Italy, which, by the way, is the area where the majority of Italians immigrated from. It was from the south. But very much what I think most people think of. I think what most Americans think of when they think of Italian cuisine is this very meat-heavy, rich cuisine, when really it's Italian-American. And I think it's why so many people, especially Americans, think it's really hard to be vegan in Italy. When people hear about how often we travel to Italy, the first thing they ask is, how do you eat? What do you find? Like, how do you eat as vegans? And they're incredulous that we'd be able to find anything to eat or anything delicious or anything traditional, certainly just anything at all. And it's remarkable to me because it's quite the opposite. It's quite the opposite experience than what most people imagine. And that makes sense because I think most people think that it's just loads of animal-based meats and cheeses and egg-based pasta. That's what they think of when they think of Italian cuisine. So, right, some of the dishes I grew up with, the dishes I grew up with, these Italian-American dishes I grew up with, lasagna and chicken parmesan and veal parmesan and spaghetti and meatballs. And I don't even want to talk about SpaghettiOs, but spaghetti and meatballs, right? Fettuccine Alfredo, garlic bread, ravioli, baked ziti and other kind of baked pasta dishes like manicotti and stuffed shells, macaroni with meat sauce, pasta with meat sauce, but it was often macaroni, mozzarella sticks, shrimp scampi, chicken piccata, veal piccata, calzones, and of course, pizza. I haven't thought about some of those dishes in a very long time, but that's what I grew up on. And to be honest, once I started traveling to Italy, right, and expanding my knowledge of Italian cuisine and history and language, it's just one of my favorite cultures, right? I've studied the food history. I love cooking Italian cuisine, native Italian cuisine. And because I've traveled to Italy so many times over the last 20 years as vegan, I don't think I I don't think I went to Italy before I was vegan. That's just not what I think about those dishes I just named when I think of Italian cuisine, right? Or put it this way. While these dishes most certainly have Italian roots, right? Most of them being Italian American, they would never be eaten or even found in Italy, okay? So don't get me wrong. This is not just a case of Americans putting sauce on something and calling it Italian cuisine. Italian American cuisine is a legitimate cuisine in the sense that it was the Italian immigrants themselves who created these dishes, right? But because of a variety of factors, they used ingredients they didn't have access to in Italy. And so began the movement of Italian American cuisine. And that biggest factor, that ingredient that they didn't have access to in Italy, especially in the South, was meat, animal meat. As I said, most of the Italians who immigrated to the United States came from southern Italy. The dire poverty of the South led to large-scale emigration from regions like Campania and Calabria and Sicily to the United States. Between 1880, 1920, that's when you have this huge influx of Italian immigrants. And so it follows logically that Italian American cuisine is mainly derived from the cuisines of southern Italy, from the cuisine, I should say cuisines, because there's so many regions and they differ so much, but sure, the cuisine of southern Italy, and modified once they were here, mostly because of the availability of certain ingredients, especially animal-based meat. That is a huge difference between Italian American dishes that I grew up on and the Southern Italian cuisine served in Italy then and now. Back in their rural villages, many Italians were vegetarian, even vegan by default, simply because they couldn't afford animal meat. This is why I will forever be emphasizing the fact that being vegan is not expensive, right? Eating plant foods is not expensive, even with the subsidies of meat and animal products. Whole plant foods are still so much more affordable, the peasant food, that's what we consider it, the peasant food, because plant foods have always been considered peasant food, and animal products have always been symbols of luxury. That is the bottom line. So you can listen to the recent podcast episode I did called Why Is It So Expensive to Be Vegan? Hint, it's not. So you can listen to more about that topic. So when the Italians arrived in the United States, they found the expensive proteins, essentially, of their homeland were more affordable and more accessible kind of everywhere in the New World. Back home, they would have just cooked with a ton of vegetables and other plant foods, grains, etc., beans, legumes, pulses, etc. But when they imported their home cooking and their family recipes to their new American home, they made modifications based on what they could afford, and meat became a prominent part of the dishes rather than a periodic small addition, right? So for example, I said I grew up on chicken Parmesan, and I hate to say veal Parmesan, it's true. That's what I grew up on. But chicken and veal Parmesan, they're not a thing in Italy. They never have been, and they're just not. They're American variations of what in Italy would have been called melanzane alla parmigiana, and that's specifically eggplant parmesan, melanzana being eggplant. So you'd have this staple of the South and Campania, especially in Sicily, both southern regions of the country. So eggplant parmesan, that's what they would have served. They would have breaded it and fried it and cooked it with sauce and cheese. Certainly with cheese. I'm not going to pretend that there wasn't cheese. There was. But it was too expensive. You wouldn't make chicken Parmesan or veal Parmesan. It was just too expensive. So they would have made eggplant Parmesan. Now, melanzane alla Parmigiana is a southern staple. And even though Parmigiana is from the town of Parma, which is in northern Italy in the Emilia-Romagna region, we'll get there another time, but still ignore that part. Ignore the fact that the Parmigiana was from the north. This dish, the eggplant Parmesan, is a southern dish. So That's why there's so much meat in Italian American cuisine. Animal meats became widely popular ingredients in many quote unquote new favorites, right? Including another Italian American creation, the meatball. Like these Italian American home cooks, because now they would have considered themselves Italian American, they're bringing their dishes over. They not only devised unique dishes based on what was available, they also adhered to existing recipes and then just kind of, modify this. You have this mix of New World and Old World. Old World being what they would have had in Southern Italy, and we'll talk about all of the tomatoes and tomato sauce, and New World being the accessibility of animal products, unfortunately, especially animal-based meat. So you've got spaghetti and meatballs. You will not find spaghetti and meatballs in Italy. You won't find it. I mean, in fact, even just having like a big slab of meat on top of pasta is not common in Italy, mostly just in America. Big slab of meat for all meals. But the Italians keep their pasta course, their primo, separate from their meat course, which is the secondo. So you wouldn't find that. So spaghetti and meatballs, completely an Italian American dish. So all that's to say is these homespun dishes originated in Italian neighborhoods along the East Coast where the immigrants came, like New York, like New Jersey, and along the East Coast, New Jersey being where I grew up, and then eventually spread to restaurants and cookbooks of the 1950s. And so you have now what is prevalent in the United States, and that's really Italian American cuisine, these American versions of Italian dishes, but much more meat heavy. Now, I realize I keep speaking in general terms about Italian American cuisine and Italian cuisine, but as you probably know, and we're going to talk about now, is that in Italy, the diet varies vastly from region to region. And while, of course, animal meat and fish are eaten depending on the location, because of a variety of factors, which we'll talk about, plant foods play a huge role in every region, especially in the South, which is where we're going to start. The fact that the cuisine differs so much from region to region. So, Italians wouldn't just talk about Italian cuisine. They would talk about the cuisine from, Emilia-Romagna, or the cuisine from Calabria, or the cuisine from the North, etc. The idea that there's just this monolithic, singular type of cuisine called Italian cuisine is actually not true. And this is one of the things I love so much about Italy. Italy is about the size of California, and yet you have 20 regions and even more variety in terms of the food. And that's why I wanted to do this episode, to share the differences with you, to share the features with you, and hopefully get you excited about cooking Italian or cooking Southern Italian, cooking cuisine from the different regions we're going to talk about, traveling to Italy, or just learning more about it. The food history in Italy is just so incredibly diverse and interesting. And that's one of the things that makes Italy so unique. Remember, Italy was not a single nation until Garibaldi unified it in 1861, right? So technically speaking, this Italian republic, is younger than the United States as a single country, because prior to that time, prior to 1861, 1862, when it became official, Italy was made up of numerous city-states, many of whom were in conflict and war with each other for centuries. They were occupied by others for centuries, and there was trade for sure, but you didn't get your culinary staples from neighboring towns. You cooked with what was in your backyard, right, so to speak. Literally what was grown right in your region. That's what you would eat. That's what you would prepare. And that's still reflected today. You could be in Rome, in the Lazio region, enjoying one dish, and you would drive an hour north to Tuscany, and you wouldn't find that dish anywhere on that menu. It's that regional. And it's so awesome. It provides so much variety. It's so wonderful. Now, as I said, I'm not going to do a podcast series on the 20 regions. That would take 20 episodes. What we're going to do is take it in larger chunks. And we're going to first talk about Southern Italian cuisine. Then we're going to talk about Northern. And then we're going to talk about cuisine from Central Italy. Unless I make a change, this is going to be a 3-part series. Now, I realize that by doing this, I've opened myself up to the big question, which is, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between northern Italy and southern Italy? And while this could be a topic of conversation and possibly contention for hours, most Italians, I think, would be okay with me drawing 2 lines. So we get northern Italy, central Italy, and southern Italy. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I might still get hate mail because I'm including Sicily in this discussion about southern Italian cuisine. I know. Because the 2 major islands, Sicily and Sardinia, are considered a 4th and separate zone. But I'm sorry. It's just easier to talk about Sicilian cuisine when I talk about the South, especially in terms of the Arab influence on the cuisines of the South and of Sicily. So I'm just making that decision, and please don't send me hate mail. I'm very aware that it's a very different region with a very different history, a very different series of dialects and language. So I realize that, but it's just going to be, I think it's going to be a lot easier for you, and I think it's going to be a lot more enjoyable for you, including Sicily here. Now, in this discussion, I'm not going to be talking about all of the popular animal-based dishes in these regions. You're going to have to go to another source for that. I'm going to be focusing on the plant-based options in these regions, in these areas, but I will be mentioning some that traditionally contain chicken's eggs or even animal milk or even animal meat, because my experience eating in Italy as a vegan is there are a lot of restaurants and vendors and home cooks who make vegan versions of what even traditionally might have animal products. So that's number one. Like, that's my experience. And of course, it's getting even more so as quote unquote veganism and plant-based eating becomes even more popular, especially in restaurants. The reason I'm going to be talking about some of these things where you might go, well, that's always with animal cheese. Like, why would you mention that? It's because this is what we do on our trips. We work with local chefs and hoteliers to make dishes that are local and traditional and regional vegan style. That's one of the reasons our trips are so unique, and it's why they're the quality they are. We're not just finding whatever vegan food we can scrape together and then serving it and calling this a vegan trip. We're eating traditional local cuisine made for vegans. And I remember one of the best compliments we ever got from one of our travelers was Leslie, who came with us to Alsace. And she was a foodie. She is a foodie. And she worked in like food and wine import, export. And she lamented, becoming vegan was like one of the best things she did. And she loved being vegan. But she really lamented that it was so difficult to find traditional cuisine in different places she traveled to. She'd get food where she would travel to, and it would be enough to sustain her and be delicious and what have you. But it wasn't local, it wasn't regional, it wasn't traditional. And in Alsace, it's one of the things we do in our Alsace trip. Same thing. Everywhere we go, we work with locals, and we work to make the dishes that might traditionally have animal products in them, but suitable for vegans. And how amazing is that? And that's what we do in Tuscany. That's what we do in northern Italy. That's what we're going to do in Sicily someday. Hopefully, we're going to do a Sicily trip. If you're interested in that, let me know. But that's something that's on our radar. So that's the reason I'm also going to be talking about some dishes that aren't just obviously vegan, but that might have animal products, but that we make sure are vegan for you. And of course, you can find recipes online for those kinds of things as well. And then the third reason is that I'm focusing on plant-based cuisine is because there's plenty of it all over Italy, especially in the South, right? So poor Italians wouldn't have called themselves vegan 100 years ago, but truly, they were essentially eating a plant-based diet. So let's start with the South. That's our topic for today. And then we'll go north, and then we'll go to the center part of this beautiful country I love so much. One way to generalize the cuisine in Italy between the North and the South, one way to generalize the South versus the North, is to think about the cultures that ruled the Southern region, or invaded, you could say, occupied, right, what have you, over the centuries, right? And you can also do the same thing in the northern region as well. So generally speaking, you've got the Arabs, you've got the Greeks, and you've got the Spanish who were in southern Italy. And that history and those cultures are still very much reflected in the cuisine, the ingredients, the availability, things that are grown there. And in the north, you had the French, the Celts, and the Germanic tribes. So that's very much reflected in the cuisine there. Now, we're going to talk about that when we get to the north. Now, that's not the only thing that determines the differences. You've also got climate, you've got topography, you've got socioeconomic factors. They also have a lot to do with what food is grown where. But thinking about the migration and occupation and trade in these areas is one more way to think about the cuisines of the north versus the cuisines of the south. And when you think of kind of your quintessential several hour long lunch in Italy with multiple generations of family members eating and drinking for hours, you're mostly thinking of the South. Of course, Northerners also love to eat and they love to be with friends and family, but in the South, they're much more attached to food and family gatherings. The North is the center of commerce and industry. It's much faster paced, but the South is more traditional, it's more laid back, and it lends itself to these long, relaxing meals. And I'm telling you, like, they go on for hours. And some of the best memories I have in the south of Italy is just having lunches that last for 3 or 4 hours. Like, there's nothing better. There's just nothing better. If I could incorporate anything into my life from Italy, it would be that. And then have a small dinner, right? Like, that's what it would, if I even had dinner. But I love the idea, especially in the summer when the days are long. There's just nothing like it. Now, another huge generalization about the South would be to say that it's much more vegetable forward than the North. Some of this has to do with the socioeconomics I mentioned. Historically, while the nobility in the South was extremely wealthy and they were enjoying all those luxurious foods, mostly animal products, meats, the South has generally been the poorest part of Italy, with much of the population subsisting on almost exclusively vegetarian, right? Greens and bread and pasta and legumes. And I've talked about this in the podcast here and in my books, that it turns out that that's a good thing because of the lower prevalence of preventable diseases when you center your diet on plant foods. It's one of the reasons why Sardinia, for instance, shows up in Dan Buettner, who is the explorer and the author who identified blue zones. The blue zones being where people live to 100 or more, to live to be 100 or more. And Sardinia is one of those places in Italy. And you know, there are a lot of factors. Some of it has to do with the community aspect. I mentioned these multi-generational families, eating together, living among one another. Some of it has to do with exercise. Some of it has to do with diet. And so when you look at the regions of people who are eating mostly plant foods, they tend to be from poorer regions. It's actually healthier. So I'm not glorifying poverty. I'm not talking about starvation, but because of these circumstances, because of this fact that when you have less money, you eat more from the plant kingdoms, you actually get food traditions that develop around that. So in Italy, for instance, you have a food tradition called cibo povero. So it's peasant food. And that is a food tradition in Italy. It's essentially the ultimate zero waste philosophy of not wasting anything. It's before zero waste became popular, but that's what this is. It's using everything you have and not wasting anything at all. And we'll talk about examples of cibo povero when we get to the north and the central regions, because there's a lot there that you're going to be familiar with. Panzanella and ribollita and polenta, even biscotti. And we'll talk about why that is considered a cibo povero. But being a historically poor region, Southern Italians would rely on what was just right all around them. Wild greens, they'd cook them up, of course, with olive oil in every single dish. Beans and pulses and legumes and lentils, that's where they got their protein from. They would use accessible, inexpensive ingredients like capers and olives, hot peppers, garlic to create flavorful and unique dishes. And they don't use garlic the way we use garlic. I mean, which they should use more. But we use garlic, I think, probably way more than even the Italians do. Sometimes we can overdo it with the garlic. But the point is, they would use what is right in their backyard, what's grown right near you. So you've got traditional dishes from this food tradition. You've got pasta e fagioli, which is pasta and beans. You've got roasted red peppers with olive oil. You've got simple bruschetta. So there's not garlic bread. Garlic bread as we think of garlic bread in the United States, Italian-American thing. You could say that maybe grew out of the tradition of bruschetta. Bruschetta is just toasted bread. That's what that means. With olive oil, you've got garlic and often tomatoes. No doubt you're familiar with that. One of my favorite dishes from this area, and I have a recipe for it actually I think it's in the 30-Day Vegan Challenge, is Jumbota. And Jumbota, sometimes pronounced ciabatta, is basically just, it's a stew, a vegetable stew of the summer produce. It's a summer stew. And it is quintessentially Southern. It is, a lot of the Southern regions have a Calabria. They would say ciabatta, but Jumbota, you'd find it elsewhere. That's G-I-A, by the way, and C-I-A, ciabatta, Jumbota. So you also have a soup called Lucardia, which is a Calabrian onion soup. So basically an onion soup. There would be cheese in it, but not in my recipes, not on our trips. And my favorite name for a soup, I haven't actually made this soup because I probably have made this soup, but I wouldn't have called it this. You've probably made this soup, but you wouldn't have called it this. But it's a soup which translates to 1,000 little things. It's a traditional Italian soup, also originating from Calabria, and it's mille cosette, mille meaning 1,000, cosette meaning 1,000 little things. So basically, you're just like adding every kind of dried bean you can that's available, vegetable stock, onions, carrots, celery, cabbage, wild mushrooms, everything you can. You cook it up, and then you cook some pasta separately, and then you later mix it together. So you've got basically a pasta vegetable soup, and then you dress it, of course, with olive oil. You get the idea. This is peasant food. This is cibo povero, or sometimes it's called cucina povera. That's what this is. Cooking with what you have, using everything you have, including homemade pasta. So homemade pasta is very common in Italy. I can't say that homemade pasta is a thing that I do. I really haven't gone down that road yet. But that's another important distinction between the North and the South. Compared with Northern and Central Italy, in the South, there's a greater use of dried pasta. In the North, pasta is made with chicken's eggs because they're more prevalent. They're more affordable in the North. But in the South, you wouldn't make pasta with chicken's eggs. It's mostly semolina flour, right? Local flour and water. That's it. And then they tend to shape them to add variety in the South. That's quintessentially Southern. So you've got your eggy pastas in the North, but in the South, you've got eggless pasta and made with harder flour as well. The durum wheat is a lot harder, firmer, so they can shape the pasta more easily. And then you get these wonderful chewy pastas like orecchiette, which is little ears, orecchiette. And by the way, if you're interested in the names of the different shapes of pasta, these different pasta shapes, I did a podcast episode recently on pasta shapes named after animals, and it's super fun. So orecchiette is from Puglia down in the south. Conchiglie, which actually winds up on that episode. Shells, so you can imagine the shell shape. That's from Campania. Now these are less rich pastas because they're not made with all the fat, right, from the eggs. So they tend to be made with heavier sauces, like rich tomato sauces. Some southern pastas are made simply with garlic and olive oil. Orecchiette is commonly paired with broccoli rabe. Other typical pastas in the south include penne, which also makes it, by the way, on the animal pasta shapes, and bucatini. Bucatini is hollowed out spaghetti, and it's David's absolute favorite pasta. And speaking of pasta, it wasn't the Italians who can claim the origins of the pastas we know and love today. It was the Arabs. The Arabs introduced durum wheat to Sicily in the 9th and 10th centuries. It has a higher gluten content. It's heartier, as I mentioned. And so it also meant, besides being able to kind of shape it, you could also keep it for longer periods of time. Pasta couscous, which is obviously made from durum wheat as well. You could store it for long periods of time. And this quite literally reduced the severity of famines that attacked people in the Middle Ages. Being able to store pastas like this meant that you'd have food, which was, a kind of a game changer. Another thing that determines the food grown in the South, of course, is the climate and the topography. Now, when it comes to animal products, in the South, there are very few cows. You don't have cows in the South. So you don't have a lot of beef. You don't have a lot of dairy-based butter. You don't have a lot of cream. That's in the North. You'd find that much more in the North. Now, again, I'm not saying that there's not meat in the South. Of course there is. It would be often more sheep, obviously seafood because of the Mediterranean Sea right there. But that region in the South is blessed with Mount Vesuvius, now blessed. At one time during the volcano eruption, it wasn't a blessing, but that volcanic soil around this region, just means that you can grow so much, and it's in this incredibly rich soil. So when you think of the quintessential Italian tomato, for example, you're most likely thinking of the San Marzano plum tomatoes that give red sauces their richness. If you were in my online pizza class, you would have heard me talk about this. If you are going to make tomato sauce, pizza sauce, tomato sauce, pasta sauce, marinara, whatever, do not make it with anything other than San Marzano tomatoes. Now, you can buy San Marzano tomatoes online. They're imported, but trust me, that's what you want for really good tomato sauce. Now, of course, in the South, you also have a ton of amazing produce because of the climate, the long, hot growing season, also because of the rich soil. So you've got, just name it, everything, flavorful produce, cauliflower, broccoli rabe, fennel, arugula or a rocket, greens and eggplant. Eggplant is in so many dishes, pepper, zucchini. You've got your figs, your almonds, your grapes, your fava beans, and of course, you've got olive oil. So the North, characterized by butter, the South characterized by olive oil. You've got all of your fragrant herbs and spices you think about when you think about Italian cuisine, your oregano, your basil, and of course you've got your citrus fruits, lemons, limes, oranges, and there are other kind of more exotic tropical fruits being grown there. Again, the climate is just really perfect for it. From the lemons, you have Limoncello, which is an Italian lemon liqueur, mainly produced in southern Italy, especially in the Sorrento region on the coast of Amalfi. So Limoncello, if you haven't had that yet, wonderful, quintessential southern Italian liqueur. The region of Abruzzo is known for those hot, spicy peppers. So if you've ever had arrabbiata, I've talked about arrabbiata. I love arrabbiata. So arrabbiata means angry because of the heat. Another quintessential southern tomato pasta dish from Abruzzo, I didn't mean to say from Abruzzo, is aglio, olio, and peperoncino. And so you've got garlic, olive oil, and hot red pepper. So that peperoncino, that's that hot red pepper. So if you're not accustomed to spicy food, it might be a little too spicy for you, but that's what the sauces are here in this region. They're angry, they're arrabbiata, spicy and fabulous. Now, staying in this region, also in the South, obviously all of the regions we're talking about are in the South. Right next to Abruzzo, you have Molise. And Molise and Abruzzo used to be one region, but they were separated in the 1960s. So in this region, in this area, and we're kind of starting to get to the center of Italy, really on the border of kind of the south and the central part of Italy. In Molise, there's a coastline on the Adriatic, so we're starting to get up there. But beans, potatoes, grapes, and olives are the primary crops of this region. And in Molise, no surprise, it shares its culinary tradition with Abruzzo. And so you've got these chilies, you've got garlic, you've got olive oil. And one of the distinct dishes, I am not going to be able to pronounce this, let's see. In Molise, it's native to Molise, is plenta di ragna. The only reason I said I couldn't pronounce it is I can't even find the translation for this. It's so interesting. So plenta di ragna is a comfort food at its best, and it's on almost every Molesani table. It's simple. It's comfort food galore. It's a polenta variation made from potatoes and wheat, and it's topped with a tomato sauce. And speaking of tomatoes, let's get to the South's most famous food, pizza, whose main ingredient, tomatoes, are also not of Italian origin, and yet we associate them with Italian cuisine probably with more than with any other food. Tomatoes, right? The tomato, of course, came from the Americas. It was only introduced to the Italians, to Italy, in the 15th or 16th century by the Catalans, by the Spanish, around that time. Now, Naples was a major port in medieval times, and thus a gateway for the entry of many cultures and cuisines. But interestingly, there was a time, during that time, other Europeans believed that this New World fruit was poisonous. But the people of Naples were like, nope, all good, bring it in, bring it on, and look what they did with it. So that's why you have so many dishes with tomatoes and tomato sauce in the South, in Naples, in Napoli. That's why they're grown here, because of the climate, but also because they received them, they accepted them, and they have just made the best use of them. And so Campania is the region that Naples is in. Naples is considered the home of pizza, though there's a lot to say about that too. Did they invent pizza? This is obviously a topic of great debate, but also just fun conversation. If you want to be literal about it, pizza is basically yeasted flatbread with various ingredients baked on it, right? And as such, Italians cannot claim its invention. That idea of just either a yeasted or non-yeasted bread with different ingredients on it, that goes back a long way. The ancient Greeks are probably really to thank for it. The Greeks were known to bake large, flat, unleavened flatbreads, topped with oils and herbs and spices and dates. And since Naples was founded as a Greek port city, pizza as we know it was developed from there, but the Greeks were really the foundation of it. And of course, as you know, the Romans took like everything from the Greeks. So, sorry, ancient Romans, don't be offended, but it's true. They were quite inspired by the Greeks. And so at first you have basically this bread with oil and herbs, right? Then later tomato sauce was added. And so pizza as we know it today, leavened bread with tomato sauce, was definitely a Neapolitan invention in Napoli, right? So hence our name for the classic thin crust pizza, the Neapolitan pizza. But it really has a tradition going back farther than that. Now, to be considered a Neapolitan pizza, there's actually a kind of rigorous standards that pizzerias and pizzaioli have to adhere to in order to be considered a Neapolitan pizza. And some of it has to do with the fact that the tomatoes have to be San Marzano tomatoes, and some other things as well. So to be considered such, there are standards and there are criteria. But that's your Neapolitan pizza. Now, you've heard me talk before about the fact that the first variation of Italian pizza, right, the pizza as we know it today, was actually completely plant-based, no cheese. This was the Marinara Pizza. It's not a vegan thing per se, but the point is you will not be looked at strangely in Italy if you ask for a pizza with no cheese. The Pizza Marinara was essentially the original pizza, and it's on the menu of every pizzeria in Italy, period, full stop. Now, it might not be called Pizza Marinara. I see it mostly called Pizza Marinara, but it might also be called Pizza all'olio e pomodoro. So you got oil, tomato, garlic, and oregano. So Pizza all'olio, oil, e pomodoro, tomato. That's what you might see it called on the menu. But Pizza Marinara, it was brought by sailors. Now, the sailors were fishing, so let's just leave that aside. This wasn't for any kind of noble cause other than feeding their families. But that's what these sailors, the marinai, they were sailors. Pizza Marinara, the sea, right? That's how you get the name Marinara. They could take this pizza, Marinara, on voyages with them and could make pizza away from home because the way you make the pizza sauce includes adding, has the tomatoes, which is acidic, which can stand up for a long period of time. It's not going to go bad for a long time. So that's why it's called Pizza Marinara. Now, in the 19th century, 1889 is the date that's often given. We see the development of the Pizza Margarita. And that's named in honor of Italy's queen at the time, Margherita. And she was visiting Naples. And that's the story goes. The chef made this pizza with tomato and mozzarella cheese and fresh basil. Of course, you've got the green, white, and red of the Italian flag. The truth is there's evidence that it was probably already being made in the early 1800s. But that's how the story goes. And that's why it's called the Pizza Margherita. Now, to further the example that traditional pizza without cheese is prevalent in Italy, in Rome you have something called pizza Bianca. Now we're going to get there when we get to Rome, but it basically translates to white pizza, right? Bianca. In the US, white pizza is pizza crust with cheese and no sauce. That's not traditionally from Italy. White pizza or pizza bianca has no bright red tomato sauce, so that's true, but it doesn't have any cheese either. And there are no fancy toppings. It's as simple as it gets. It's just basically focaccia, fresh baked bread, focaccia essentially, topped with olive oil, some salt, maybe some sesame seeds, maybe some rosemary if you're feeling adventurous. And in the southern region of Calabria, you have a street food favorite called Pita Calabrese, which is in Catanzaro, which is a town in Calabria. It's also just a focaccia bread in the shape of a donut or like a bagel. Picture that. And it's filled with toppings. Sometimes it's topped with toppings. Lots of times it could be meat and cheese, but you can make your own. And it's just basically, it's basically a focaccia dough with shaped like a donut. And it's very basic and very delicious, and you can make a vegan version at home. So just to make the point that when we think of pizza, Americans are always like, you can't have pizza without cheese. Yes, you can, because the Italians have been doing that for hundreds of years. So don't give me that. And actually, just this idea of flatbread, something with toppings on it, has been going on for thousands of years. We just call it different things. So this idea that you cannot have dairy-based cheese and it's not pizza otherwise, it's just not true. Not true. Now, in the South, where the quintessential tomato is, you have lots of other dishes with tomato sauce. I already mentioned, pizza's obvious. I already mentioned the eggplant parmesan. That's from Campania. So is lasagna, right? Now, typically, the ingredients Italians use in their lasagna does depend on the part of Italy you're from. So there's lasagna Napolitana, which is made with layers of pasta and ragu. Now, ragu is a tomato sauce brand that I grew up with in New Jersey, but it typically means meat sauce. So that would be part of the lasagna, and you've got ricotta cheese and mozzarella and sausage and meatballs. So that's kind of your typical Napolitana lasagna. But then in the north, in Emilia-Romagna, you've got ragu, but you've also have bechamel sauce and the local Parmigiano Reggiano cheese. So it does depend, like your lasagna, depending on where you're from, and it really reflects the different cheese that you use. But another difference between the North and the South lasagna is that in Napoli, in the South, you have rippled noodles that you use for your lasagna. And in the North, in the Emilia-Romagna region, you've got the flat noodles. In the United States, we tend to use rippled to make lasagna, but I have to say my favorite lasagna noodles is the no-boil lasagna noodles. I know that's not traditional. I'm also not making my own lasagna noodles, so I'm fine with that. It definitely eliminates a step. So if you can find the no-boil lasagna noodles, they are flat. They're not ridged. I haven't found them, at least, to be ridged. They're wonderful, and they make it a lot easier. We made lasagna in the Valentine's Day class from 2022. So if you're interested, those recipes are in the on-demand class at joyfulvegan.com. Now, let's move a little farther south to Sicily, to Sicilia, which I said is considered its own region, but it shares characteristics with the South, and I want to talk about it here. And the obvious thing is it shares with the rest of Italy too, is just it's local tradition, local flavor. I mean, they eat so locally that even cannoli are eaten by locals only at certain times of the year. They wouldn't, tourists would eat cannoli throughout the year, but they would eat it only at certain times of the year, right? So there's your regional. It's so regional in terms of the food that's eaten and grown. First and foremost, before we move on to anything else and we talk about any of the produce, of course, I will mention the Sicilian dish that you were probably most familiar with, and that is pizza, Sicilian-style pizza. It's closer to focaccia than a traditional Neapolitan pie. You typically kind of have a deeper dish, and you lack this kind of bordered crust. You don't have like a separate bordered crust. Your sauce goes right to the edge of the spongy bread. So there's your Neapolitan pizza and your Sicilian pizza. And don't even get me started with New York style pizza and Chicago pizza. I couldn't tell you the differences between all those. My favorite is Neapolitan pizza. I am more of a fan of thin crust pizza. I do have a deep dish pizza, which is really fun. It's from the pizza class. So that's also in the on-demand class at joyfulvegan.com. What's your preference? I'd be very interested to know. Now, Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean, and it reveals influences of Greek, Arab, and Spanish cuisine, as well as Italian. So this is where I'm talking about. There's just so much influence from these cultures that the South also has. And it's hard to separate talking about Sicilian in the South if I'm going to talk about Greek and Arab and Spanish influences and cuisines. Now, you've got obviously tons of fruit production. You've got lemons and the blood oranges and tangerines. You've got olives, and the cuisine itself has been renowned for centuries. And I should really say millennia, since classical Greece, during the Roman Empire, during the Roman times. I mean, it has just been celebrated for so many, now thousands of years. It's close to North Africa. So as I mentioned, you've got the Arabs who were occupying the island from the 9th through the 11th centuries. And this is still highly visible. When you think of some of the things that you think of as Sicilian ingredients, really, they go back to the Middle Eastern ingredients. Think about couscous, raisins, almonds, pine nuts, apricots, sugar, citrus, rice, saffron, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, cinnamon. All of these are Middle Eastern ingredients. So you can see the influence of the Arabs in this region. It's just incredible. And even that idea of combining like acidic and sweet ingredients like you have in caponata, it's a hallmark of Arabic cuisine. And caponata is the dish most people would associate with Sicily than any other, maybe besides the Sicilian pizza that you're familiar with. Caponata is one of my absolute favorite eggplant dishes. It consists of chopped eggplant, fried often, other vegetables. You've got olives in there and tomatoes and celery and capers and of course, olive oil. And the dish itself may have been introduced to Sicily during the Arab conquest in the 9th century. And it's a delight if you've never tried it. Now, most versions are by default vegetarian, even vegan, but be mindful if you're traveling. In Palermo, sometimes they have fish and some versions may have anchovies. But capers does the job. They do the job of providing that salty deliciousness perfectly well. I do have a caponata in the 30-day vegan challenge. Another famous local Sicilian dish made from eggplant is pasta alla Norma, which is fried eggplant again, tomato sauce, and basil. It's named after Norma, an opera by Bellini. And so you've got pasta alla Norma. And then you also just have eggplant, just like fried in olive oil there in Sicily. That's very common. So delicious, so simple. They do eggplant so well in Sicily. Another Sicilian staple that came from the Arabs is arancini, which literally means little oranges, arancini, because they resemble little oranges. So they are delectable rice balls that are stuffed, coated with breadcrumbs, and deep fried. They're so good. Now, they're typically stuffed with animal meat, but not on our trips. We enjoy arancini. We do have arancini on our Tuscany trip, even though it's way far north. But they're so good. They're so fantastic. I love arancini. And then another Arab import is granita. Granita is a semi-frozen dessert made from sugar and water and various flavorings. So it's originally from Sicily. It's obviously available throughout Italy in various forms. I have 2 recipes for granita in Color Me Vegan. So when I say various flavorings, I have a chocolate granita, for instance. I have a watermelon granita. You can make granita from any fresh fruit. You can do it from really any ingredient. They're just wonderful. It's almost like shaved ice if you think about, but much healthier because you're using whole ingredients, much more delicious. You're not using like flavored sugar. But that's essentially what granita is. It's that kind of texture because basically you're freezing, raking, freezing, raking, freezing, raking until you get all of these like small little ice crystals. And they're so good. So if you have Color Me Vegan, break it out and make chocolate granita or watermelon granita. It's something I make throughout the summer when I'm just getting fresh fruit, summer fruits, delicious. In Sicily, though, it would be enjoyed for breakfast or as a snack. It wouldn't be a dessert at the end of the meal. So that's different in that way. And even though we think about Sicily, when we think of granita, it looks like it goes back to when the Arabs were there again in the 9th and 10th centuries. The Arabs brought over a recipe of sherbet, so it looks like it's inspired by that recipe. And sherbet would have been fruit juice flavored with rose water and then iced, and also added some other really fragrant ingredients like sandalwood or roses. And so that seems to have inspired granita, which is quintessential Sicilian dessert. Another quintessential Sicilian dessert I mentioned already has its roots in Sicily, not in the Middle East or North Africa, is cannoli. And the singular version is cannolo. Remember, if you see an I at the end of an Italian word, in this case, a noun, it is usually the masculine plural. So the masculine singular would be cannolo, and cannoli is the plural. So don't ask for cannoli if you're looking for a single cannolo. Cannoli is the plural. So it's a Sicilian dessert. It is believed to have come from Palermo, that region there, Messina, and it means little tube in Sicilian. And it basically consists of, fried pastry dough curled into a tube, injected with a creamy ricotta filling, and sprinkled with crushed nuts, crushed pistachios, any kind of nut, and chocolate chips, or chocolate chips, I should say. Now, again, vegan cannoli, I gotcha, but typically in Sicily, it's going to be made with dairy products. Now, other sweets from Sicily are the best sweets you could get, and those are the fruits. They grow throughout the year. Arance, your oranges, limoni, lemons, fragole, strawberries, you've got peaches, pesche, you've got cherries, ciliegie, that's a really tough one to say. You've got meloni, melons, watermelon, interesting in Italian. Angurie is watermelons. Angurie is watermelons. Fichi, figs, uva, grapes, just a few, but you've got fruits coming out of the yin yang because Sicily, because sun, because climate, because Italy. So before we leave Italy in the south, before we leave the food in the south, let's briefly mention wine. I mentioned liqueur. I mentioned a limoncello, which is the liqueur from lemons. But as far as wine, southern Italy really was probably really instrumental in viticulture, in the cultivation of grapes for winemaking. But it's not really thought about. It's starting to make a comeback. But when I think about wine in Italy, I do think about the north. But southern Italy has been producing wine for over 4,000 years, a really long time. So it's starting to make a comeback. For a long time, the grapes in southern Italy were used as blending grapes and then exported to France and Germany. But there are some wonderful wines. I mean, obviously, there are some wonderful wines in the south. specifically got grapes. I'm trying to think of ones that you would be familiar with that would be imported here. Primitivo is probably the most well-known as far as the reds go. Nero d'Avola might be another one you're familiar with. As far as the white grapes go, you've got Vermentino, you've got Trebbiano. So those are some well-known southern grape varietals. I mentioned Nero d'Avola. That's the most widely planted and celebrated grape in Sicily. And then you've got probably the most well-known wine from Sicily is Marsala wine, but it's a fortified wine. It's produced near the town of Marsala on Sicily, and it's made with local white grape varietals and supplemented with a distilled spirit. That's why it's a fortified wine, in this case, often brandy. Now, you might not have ever had a glass of Marsala wine, but you've probably had chicken Marsala. That's an Italian-American dish made with Marsala wine. So I promise you, if you ask me, I will make a vegan version of the chicken Marsala if you request it, because that's what I do. Now, again, my familiarity with Italian wines is limited, but it's typically I'm better versed in wines from the north, and the north is where we will go to next. But to recap, the south. The cuisine is influenced by the rich Vesuvius soil, by the long, hot growing seasons. You've got lots of vegetables and fruits, by the influence of the Mediterranean, by past occupants and traders, the Greeks, the Arabs, and the Spanish. You've got the topography we talked about. There's so much that distinguishes the South from the North, and there's so much that distinguishes the regions in the South from one another. And I hope you walk away with just at least a better understanding, hopefully, than when you first came and first started listening. I hope. And we will be going to the north next, and there's so much to talk about there. We are cutting off the south around just above Rome. So we are going to go to the central part as well. We're going to come back to the center. We're going to go up to the north next, and then we're going to go to central Italy. And just to remind you, you can travel with me to one of my favorite places in the world, this country, these regions, this food, this language, this history. I just absolutely love this country so much. And you can experience all of this for yourself and everything I've been talking about. We do have spots for our Tuscany trip in June 2022 and our Northern Italy trip in June 2022. Some people are coming to both trips. We are offering a perk if you come to both trips, but you're very welcome to do that. Go check out joyfulvegantrips.com. And just to also remind you that I have recipes for a lot of the dishes I named. I mentioned a couple when we were talking, the Jumbota I've got in the 30-Day Vegan Challenge. That's the summer vegetable stew. I have a panzanella in the 30-Day Vegan Challenge. I have a caponata in the vegan table. I have the granita in Color Me Vegan 2. I have the chocolate granita and the watermelon granita. I have on-demand classes. We've done Neapolitan pizza. We've done making your own pizza sauce, making your own pizza dough. I've done deep dish. I mentioned the lasagna we did in the Valentine's Day class from 2022. I've got homemade cashew mozzarella, so you can make your own margarita pizza with mozzarella. You can even make mozzarella sticks. You can find that in the air fryer on demand class. And then we've got some great live classes coming up. I'm celebrating my Italian ancestry here, but I'm going to be celebrating my Irish ancestry in a St. Patrick's Day virtual vegan cooking class coming up March 12th. I know this will be dated very soon, but still go check out joyfulvegan.com and join me in that trip. And as always, you can get a discount if you join more than one class at a time. So I've got a brunch class also. You can take those recipes and use them for Mother's Day brunch, Easter brunch, Passover brunch. And I'm very excited about the newest class we have just added, which is burgers and buns. We're making mushroom pecan burgers, beet burgers, and pretzel buns. Not Italian at all. Please go check them out at joyfulvegan.com. For the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. I'm going to go eat. I'm trying to think of what it's going to be because I've been talking about food for the last hour and I'm starving, but I'm also inspired. So I hope to see you soon. This is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.